As Melissa said, I'm going to talk about the responses of the international community, the options that are available. But first, I'd like to deal with the question of why the international community is engaged and why the international community should be engaged. And I'm reminded of my own visit to the island in February of 2012 in that regard, because I see, first of all, the fact that as fellow human beings, we have an obligation everywhere in the world to protect the rights, the universal human rights of our fellow humans. And I'm reminded, and that includes, of course, the rights to truth and justice after serious violations of human rights. I'm reminded of the day I was in Molativu and a group of women whose children had gone missing, who themselves were broken and bent from shrapnel that they'd received during the no-fire zone, were in a church and pulled themselves across the room to show me pictures of their children that were missing. They weren't partisans of the LTTE. Indeed, in most cases, the children had been abducted and made into child soldiers, but had been seen later in mid-May, even after the defeat of the LTTE, and then had disappeared. And I promised to follow up and continue to do that. And a few days later, I heard a report back that those women had been harassed by the security service and threatened with jail themselves. And the interpreter that I had during that visit reported to me that the women's response was, if we can't have the truth about our loved ones, you might as well just kill us. You might as well just kill us, because life's not worth living. And that's something I think that all of us in the world need to empathize with and act on, and that what continues to motivate me. The other problem is that there can be further victims in the future, further crimes. I can recall when I was there, I would engage, as we did, and our strategy in the US government for about 3 years was to really press hard for national authorities to live up to their obligations. And I'd hear people say, we need to turn the page. We need to focus on development. These issues are too difficult. We'll alienate the nation's heroes. And what I noted to them was that violations were continuing. They weren't necessarily the same kind of violations, but that people were being abducted. There were crimes and corruption that the same people, some of the same people involved in the violations, were committing these acts. That impunity was contagious, and that the message sent that you could get away with killing innocent people, you could get away with killing people that had surrendered and that were helpless. Facts that were found even by commissions in Sri Lanka, that you could get away with that, led people to think they could get away with other things as well. We saw it during the last few years when there was actually some effort to deal with the so-called emblematic cases. These weren't those that related directly to the end of the conflict. Those seemed to be radioactive. But I can recall in particular the Trinco 11 case of 11 schoolboys abducted during the same time period, but nothing political, nothing terrorist about it at all. They were of different ethnicities and religions, and they were kidnapped and held at the naval base at Trinco by a number of officers in order to extort, in the end, to murder them. And to obtain money from their parents. And there were diligent efforts to prosecute those cases, despite obstruction. Multiple individuals that were charged. And now, with this new government, we see that effort, that fledgling effort at justice in dealing with unrelated, to some extent, crimes, but some of the same folks, is being obstructed. There's a commission, this commission on political victimization, which is in fact a commission for the obstruction of justice. And what an outrage it is that the head of that commission that's trying to prevent the prosecution of people involved in the abduction and murder of innocent boys is now head of the missing persons office. And we just see this sort of defiance of the rule of law, of the idea of accountability. And something that creates then an epidemic, frankly, of impunity, which threatens others in the future who could suffer the same kind of crimes from whatever community. And that's why we need to respond. Now, of course, we'll hear from the government, oh, we'll do something ourselves. But we've had before the Lessons Learned Commission, the Reconciliation Commission. Notice the word truth was missing there. They did, however, find there were 6 incidents in which there was strong suspicion of civilians being killed, and no action was taken. A military inquiry closed that investigation without any response. The Paranagama Commission talked about the killing of surrenderees, the white flag killings, the killing of the 12-year-old boy, found that there was credible evidence, no follow-up at all. And now we're even hearing the government, as it tries to deflect the efforts to a resolution in the next council, is talking about a commission to look at what happened on accountability in the past, which of course is another effort to close the door and to obstruct justice. Finally, from an international point of view, what we're doing here is, I think, dealing with the credibility of our whole system. We have other places in the world where horrible things continue to occur, in Syria, in Myanmar, in South Sudan, and elsewhere. And the UN Human Rights Council has become the go-to place in those situations to get commissions established to find the facts and to begin to lay the grounds for accountability. If the message out of the Sri Lanka process is, well, you can wait it out, after 10 years, they can say, well, enough already, close it and let them get on with their business. What does that say for the victims in these other situations? What is the prospect in the future for the credibility in terms of the enforcement and compliance with human rights? It won't be just an epidemic of impunity, it'll be a pandemic of impunity. And that's what the world risks if we don't grasp the obligation that all of us, I think, have, and make sure that we continue this fight for truth and justice for the people of Sri Lanka. So what can be done? First of all, there's the UN side of it, and that's not the only part of it. And very, very pleased with the strong report of the High Commissioner on these issues. Obviously, the need to continue monitoring, whether that's done by her office or by a special rapporteur, extremely important that this stay on the radar screen. But I'm particularly excited by the second recommendation, 61B, that calls for a dedicated capacity to collect and preserve evidence and other related information for future accountability process, and to support universal jurisdiction until and if there's a genuine process at the national level. We've seen that this has been done earlier in the case of North Korea, but most particularly, but in a larger way, in the case of Syria and Myanmar. And of course, the UN has done some great reports in which all of us have been involved in supporting those efforts and assisting those efforts. But it's very important to develop evidence that can be used in court, that connects the dots between the horrors that happen, the people that are killed, the innocents, the helpless that are targeted, and those that really made it happen. Not always the low-level people who are pushed along or draftees in this effort, but those that caused it to occur. And drawing those connections, which we've had to do in my own experience as an international prosecutor in the Rwanda Tribunal, or at Sierra Leone, where I prosecuted a chief of state. That's extremely important, and that is a place where this can be done. And of course, there's a lot of work that's been done, and it's done by civil society, but it needs to be vetted and verified. And this can be a resource to national prosecutors when they do have an individual who's in country or someone that they can get their hands on that they can prosecute. And we've seen that even in Syria, where the conflict continues, there's been an excellent case prosecuted in Germany against two officers alleged to be involved in torture, sending a clear signal to those victims back in Molativu and elsewhere that justice is possible. It's not enough, but it's a start. It's a bit of an inoculation against this epidemic of impunity. Additionally, the UN, of course, needs to deal with the vetting of peacekeepers, and there's been positive messaging on that. And in the past, there was the work of the Commission for Human Rights in Sri Lanka working on vetting, and of course, that's no longer independent. It has a minister in charge of it. But now the UN really does need to step up, working with my own country that has a Leahy vetting program, and make sure that that people don't go back into peacekeeping, and that we don't rely on Sri Lankan peacekeepers. As important as peacekeeping is in the world, until it cleans up its act and actually follows up on the credible allegations that have been made in the past in terms of the Haiti force and others. And I saw how those were just completely swept under the rug. The UN can't be credible in the world if it sends out peacekeepers with human rights violations, full stop. And the UN itself needs, as Charles reported, certainly in terms of the events of 2009, but this is the continued problem. It can get involved in trying to work in certain areas and then de-emphasizing human rights, putting it on the back burner, wanting to work on technical assistance in some area or another. It can't be conflicted that way. No normalization. Not with a government that's engaged in mass impunity. Not in a government that's defying the rights, the most fundamental rights to truth and justice for people whose very right to life, the most fundamental right, and to human dignity in the Human Rights Declaration are not being upheld. Then what other things can be done? And it's not at the UN, where obviously the UN Security Council would presumably be blocked, where effective action may be limited in terms of the ability to put on sanctions, for instance, as the Security Council has done in other situations. There, individual states can step up, particularly with this global Magnitsky sanctions regimes that have been established in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and now in Europe. As you know, the United States, even under President Trump, put Shavendra Silva on the global Magnitsky list. Others should follow, based upon the evidence, including the evidence that's going to be developed by this dedicated capacity. And that can also open the way for prosecutions of those that may enable those individuals or engage their financial transactions. Those individuals and companies can be prosecuted, as we've had some that have involved billions of dollars in fines for banks that have engaged in transactions with sanctioned individuals. Send that kind of clear message. There are also things in terms of aid and trade, and of course, we don't want people to suffer. We don't sanctions when they attack a whole nation, I think, are inappropriate, and we need to find ways that target these kind of measures. But of course, at the same time, we have to make demands if international resources are going to go to Sri Lanka, that there be inclusive governance, that it not be a majoritarian, Sinhala state that ignores the interests of Muslims, Hindus, ignores the interests of the Muslim and Tamil communities, and only serves a certain interest. It has to serve all interests, and certainly when even when something so important as the International Monetary Fund's aid, which the government may seek in the near future, in part because of the obligations taken on with China by the previous government, high interest loans for unwise development projects. Now they need aid from the international community. It ought to be a clear condition that Sri Lanka is in fact not going forward with this sort of process of impunity and of only aiding certain communities, but that it be an inclusive process, and that there be justice in that process, and there be support to it. These things have to mean something if those victims are going to have their rights to truth and justice, and particularly if we're going to deter violations in Sri Lanka in the future and globally. And that's why the international community, I hope, and I'll certainly be engaged as much as I can, will be seeking to pass a resolution that follows up on the earlier resolutions, follows up on the obligations that the government itself signed on to in unanimous resolution in 2015 for transitional justice, which obviously includes that Truth Commission, which is extremely important and didn't happen, and includes the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for serious violations.
Thank you. The next question comes from Amal Abayawardena from the UK. There were countless atrocities committed by the LTTE who violated the rights of Tamils that they claimed to represent. there is a lack of confidence in Sri Lanka that these crimes will be investigated or acknowledged by the UN. How can the international community help by investigating human rights violations on all sides, including those committed during the JVP uprisings and the IPKF period, and investigating the role of the supporters of the LTTE who supplied material resources to the Tigers when human rights violations were committed? Stephen, you spoke about international justice. Perhaps you can pick that one up for us. Thank you.
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons why this mechanism would be very important. And I would note that, the Dutch had a case involving LTTE support. And so to some extent, that's where we've had precedents. I would note that obviously we didn't have justice in any significant way about LTTE violations in Sri Lanka, albeit by a government that hated the LTTE. I remember raising this issue with Defense Secretary Gotabaya, now President Rajapaksa, when I was there, and saying, we're willing to assist you, anything you can do. Of course, recalling that many of the individuals that could have been charged were, in fact, according to credible evidence, killed after surrender. Numbers of around 360 that are given out. So the number of suspects for violations that may have occurred in the conflict zone wasn't there. And I remember the Defense Secretary saying, "Oh, trials, they go on so long, and people get off." And then he said, "I killed them. I killed them. I killed them." That's not justice. Justice is when you hear about the evidence, when victims are able to come forth and talk about their children being abducted. Supposedly one child would be taken for the LTD. In many cases, multiple children were taken, and these were horrors. And we had attacks on buses, and the use of suicide bombers, etc. Some of the things that happened in the rest of the world, child soldiers, suicide bombers, in a sense, came to us from Sri Lanka. So it's important to have justice on both sides, on all sides, and indeed that could still happen on the island. Instead we have things like the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and an emphasis on sort of saying someone's associated on one side or another, or digging out evidence of someone's political connections, et cetera, not on the conduct. And what you fundamentally need, and this is so important even as we deal with terrorism prosecutions in the West, is conduct. The murder of innocents, the sexual slavery, the torture, the other things that sometimes occur from non-state actors. This is what needs to be presented, as it certainly does from the point of view of state actors. Of course, the state actors that were involved in these crimes that have been identified and mentioned and that we're familiar with haven't been prosecuted, and some went on to commit other offenses and to engage in acts of corruption. And that clearly sends a bad signal. So that justice needs to be even-handed and needs to be done fairly. And of course, at the international level, often it'll depend on whether in a particular country there's a target over which they have jurisdiction. So that's the imperfect way to do it. The far better way would have been the recommendation that the government subscribed to in Resolution 30/1 to have a court with international presence that would have given credibility. I recall in other places where for instance, in Bosnia, where we had a state court and it had people from each of the three communities, but initially people from the international community, and victims were much more confident, at least at the beginning, when they saw someone from the international community, because they said, well, this isn't a person that's a partisan here. And so it does, even though in the end, I think the domestic participants did a fantastic job there. It aids that perception of independence. And it's so tragic that this wasn't taken up, that it wasn't implemented, that nothing really happened in that regard, even under this coalition government that we had during the period between 2015 and 2019. Yeah, and indeed, we are in an era where we want to be smarter about our sanctions, though I do think it's important that people remember that the world coming together on apartheid in South Africa had an impact, and the fact that we even had sanctions adopted in the U.S. over a presidential veto, I think was quite important. So sometimes you need to do those kinds of things. Obviously, to the extent that you can target this at the perpetrators and limit their ability to use foreign financial institutions, indeed, and travel bans and everything else, and the sort of message that when you get out there you might be prosecuted. That's an extremely important message. But I do think that the idea of development is normal or trade is normal. We've had, of course, during the earlier period, the GSP plus, preference for textiles coming from Sri Lanka. That's really a kind of reward that should only be there for a country that's observing the relevant standards. Those things are important. It needs to hurt. And certainly when it comes to the IFIs, as we call them, the international financial institutions. And I know in my own government, there's real reluctance to use those tools or the votes that the U.S. has. But several times our Congress has passed laws that require the U.S. to vote in a particular way. And so, people can go to their own parliaments in Europe or in America and say, we shouldn't vote this particular way until we have 1, 2, 3. And with clear conditions and reasonable ones. But obviously, if you're talking about development, it needs to be balanced. It needs to be, you need to have the rule of law. If you don't have the rule of law, anything you build can be torn down the next day. So, it's crazy to think you can develop on a rotten foundation, to be frank. And I think that's the message that clearly has to be in the minds of people that are engaged in development and trade and everything else, that there should be conditions and that's one of the ways in which you can have an impact. Yes, I would like to underline that recommendation for the dedicated capacity. And of course, the UN has done some great work here with the panel of experts and with the OISL investigation. Though I know myself from dealing with prosecution at the other end of this and working with national prosecutors, quite often when they turn to the UN and they ask for the information, they say, well, the witnesses didn't get conformed consent. We've got nobody to go back and check. There isn't a lot sometimes of assistance available. And a mechanism like this would allow the witnesses to be spoken to, would allow videos, including the videos taken by soldiers themselves of some of these horrors, to be verified within the modern technology that can eliminate the fakes and determine whether they're real. And to really build the dossiers in ways that when there was an opportunity in a third country, or hopefully an opportunity in the future, that evidence will be there in a verifiable way. And that's something we can do now. And if we don't have this, it won't happen. And then it won't be there when there's that opportunity for justice. So it's something that we can do now. It's not as good as the Syria or Myanmar one. It's going to be much smaller, but it's a step in the right direction.